Back in 2018, Trump cabinet members voted to separate migrant children from their parents. That's according to two officials who were there. NBC News justice correspondent Julia Ainsley, one of the reporters who broke this story. Julia, we had some audio issues before. Thank you for coming back to be with us. Oh, and do I hear, what is that?
I'm sorry, we are having lots of, you could call it difficulties, you could call it fun around the house today. I'm trying to join you, Allison, and the longer I waited, the less my baby wanted to wait. So this is Mary Wells making her debut on News Now. If you don't mind, she's going to join us.
We are honored, Julia. Thank you so much for being here. It's a blessing that we had audio issues before so that we get to see her. Thank you. And tell us about this story that you broke, about this vote and what it led to.
Well, I can say it's, quite something, and really puts it into perspective now to have a baby after talking about the way that these officials spoke about separating children. In 2018, White House advisor Stephen Miller, who has been the architect of many of Trump's most draconian immigration plans, was in a Situation Room meeting where he attacked then Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen for not doing enough to separate children in order to prosecute everyone who crossed the border, including parents of young children. He said, let's put it to a vote. Forget the logistics, forget any warnings that children might be separated and might not be reunited with their parents. Let's put this to a vote and see who wants to move forward. A sea of hands went up, according to two officials who were in the room, who spoke to myself and my colleague Jacob Soboroff. And very soon after, Kirstjen Nielsen, even though she had first opposed, she did sign the memo and they went forward. So it shows it's a moment in time, but it shows that the idea that family separations were an unfortunate byproduct is not true. This was strategic, and a number of high-level cabinet officials were invited to this meeting, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, then National Security Advisor John Bolton, Kirstjen Nielsen, Alex Azar of HHS, all invited. And we understand from that vote, they moved forward soon after.
Julia, as you sit here with your baby and we talk about families being separated, I can't help but think about the concerns about morality here, the concerns about humanity. Did that come up at all? And are you getting any response to your reporting from the administration, from people who were in that meeting? What can you tell us there?
Well, it is interesting. I asked, did that come up? And a source said, in any arguments about morality when it came to immigration with this administration, whether that be to Miller or the president himself, simply fell on deaf ears. You could talk about logistics, you could talk about money and resources and the law, but you could not talk about morality. And so the impact this would have on children, on their families, that wasn't even mentioned. Now, we have heard from the White House that they say this did not happen, that they did not have a show of hands vote, but we stand by our reporting and we're very confident based on the people who we've interviewed for this story. And thank you for having us both, Allison.
Julie. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I know that we are taking you from your family this afternoon, so thank you for still finding the time to be with us. Working moms are just amazing. Julia, I can't believe that you just did that with a little one on your lap. I'm very impressed.
Thank you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here. And click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.